Well, that's fine.
Perfect.
Yes. So, welcome to this discussion. It's going to be a fun discussion today. We have Arun, who's going to talk about SeLFIES, which is a new way of delivering an inflation-linked income, which circumvents the traditional suppliers in the market. I think it also can be quite intriguing to learn a bit more on how it works and what are the things that could follow if we have something like that. Secondly, I will have a little bit of discussion what I think is important, particularly for members, and particularly when you come to the retirement. It's more like what kind of choice architecture should we offer members? And what are the lessons we could learn or not learn from the savings phase and auto enrollment? And then Henry, he's going to talk about how member perceives this and what is sort of the user experience and what a member need from their pensions. And I think that's a really important dimension because most of us in the industry tend to build solutions that are very complicated and perhaps not thinking so much on how the end user will experience it. And finally, Simon Eagle, he's going to talk about collective DC, which is a hot topic across the world. And as we said in the pre-talk on this, is that there's no CDC solution that is dominating the world. They all are very, very different. So we're going to hear about Simon's thoughts on how do you build a CDC solution for the post-retirement phase when it comes to the UK market mainly. So I think with that introduction, I think we're going to have a very productive hour here together. And you who are listening, I hope you're going to enjoy this debate and discussion. So I think I'm going to hand over to the first of us, that's Arun, and he's going to talk about SeLFIES.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you, Henry, and thank you, Simon. Essentially, where I came to this idea was I actually was battling the World Bank in the mid-1990s when they were convincing countries to privatize pay-as-you-go defined benefit Social Security. And they stupidly, in my opinion, decided to change all three aspects of a failing system, which meant they went to funded, which was acceptable. They went from DB to DC, and they went from government-sponsored to privately owned. And Professor Modigliani and I argued back in '97 itself that this is going to be a disaster because DC is, the other end of the spectrum where you're expecting individuals to make the correct decisions. But I was managing the World Bank's pension plan at that time, which was a very good defined benefit. And I was struggling with some of the best people in the world helping me manage that portfolio. So it struck me as incredibly difficult for somebody in a DC system to have to make all these complicated decisions themselves when you truncate DB, which is an intergenerational sort of transfer, risk sharing agreement to a single lifetime in which you have to get all this correct. And essentially what I realized was my own DC's plan was terribly managed. As I said, I manage pension assets for a living. I've made clients a lot of money, but my own DC plan was a mess. Fundamentally, because even though we went from DB to DC, the goal of the retirement system was unchanged, which is I wanted to be able to have a guaranteed retirement lifestyle, which continued my pre-retirement lifestyle into retirement. And the available instruments just wouldn't allow me to do this. Fortunately, my first job at the World Bank was issuing bonds, some very complicated bonds. And it struck me that what was missing in the market was essentially an instrument which paid me nothing until I hit the age of 65. And then let's say from 65 for 20 years, which is the average life expectancy in most developed countries, this bond would pay me $10 real per month. Per year, so that I would get 20 years of $10 real from the day I bought it. Now, why did I pick the number $10 real? Very simply because very often you're asked, what's your retirement goal in a wealth number, which is complete nonsense because depending on where interest rates are on the date of retirement, you're bearing a lot of interest rate risk. And therefore, a wealth number is never static, it's very dynamic and makes it very hard for an individual, let's say an Uber driver or the gentleman who cuts my lawn, to know what his goal in retirement is. However, if I have a bond that pays $10 real per year from the day I start to retire till the day ostensibly I die, then if my goal is to have $50,000 or 50,000 pounds, You just divide 50,000 by 10. Your goal is buy 5,000 of these bonds before you hit retirement. Now, the beauty of this bond is you can start to do this from age 25 onwards. And that's what we were advocating, and Brazil has actually done this, was you allow people to start locking in bricks of retirement income at any age in their life cycle. Now, this is not to say that they own 100% of this, because they can mix it with stocks, and they can have dynamic allocations, which I've also advocated for. But at least at any point in time when they want to lock in retirement income, it's a market-based instrument. It's extremely low cost because it's government issued. It's extremely low risk. Again, it's default-free in the currency of your country. It's liquid, which is if you decide to change your mind, you sell it back either to the market or to the government. It's extremely simple. It requires only two inputs from the individual: my date of retirement and my target real income, which could all change because the bond is liquid and saleable and purchasable in any sort of quantity and any time. And more importantly, the way Brazil did it, which was brilliant, was you can buy it in slices of as little as £5 or $5 at a time. So literally, you're an Uber driver, somebody tips you $5 extra for a ride, you could start to buy a slice of retirement income in denominations that are that simple, right? And so now the big question is, why should it be the government that issues it? Having issued bonds, the most critical thing to do whenever you're trying to create a yield curve is you need a default-free benchmark. And so the government in a country is the most sort of risk-free issuer. Well, in some cases, the World Bank and the IFC might have been as AAA issuers. But for most countries like the UK and the US, the benchmark curve is the government curve. And the government has many incentives to do this. One is if people retire poor, the government's going to bail them out. So with existing products, every stock and every bond that you currently hold in your defined contribution pension plan is a risky asset relative to that retirement goal that I articulated. And weirdly enough, no country has got regulations that actually prevent you from doing that. In fact, in the US, they encourage you to buy a target date fund, which is a completely ridiculous product that guarantees nothing, and you get legal cover for it. The second reason why it's advantageous for governments to issue this is, in the UK especially, you want to raise money for infrastructure. What better way to fund infrastructure than a bond that actually collects capital now and pays it back in the future, inflation adjusted, for building a road or a highway or whatever else you want to do? In the developing world, having debt issuance that is domestic or domestic currency oriented is very valuable because it creates a lot more stability and it extends the yield curve. So there are multiple reasons why the government is the natural issuer, which is not to say that corporates or other companies cannot issue after this, but they would be the initial issuer clearly. And there are multiple benefits for the financial services industry, because if you're an insurance company, you cannot provide today a real longevity indexed instrument without the hedging instrument. You're going to just charge your clients an inordinate amount of money, and you're going to make the product inflexible because you cannot hedge it properly. If you're an asset manager today, you cannot guarantee retirement income. You're just arbitrarily playing with stocks and bonds and giving people a very random outcome. So this instrument, by becoming the safe asset of retirement, solves a lot of those problems. And so at a very high level, I'll just introduce the topic that way to say it's an instrument that basically pays you a steady stream of real income denominated in a very fixed currency unit, so that it dumps down the calculations to nothing more than your date of retirement and the amount of target income you want. And in Brazil, they've actually launched it off an app. And within the first 5 months, 56,000 people bought it, raising 1 billion reais, which is a lot. So it's just been successful in Brazil. And therefore, for me, it's a no-brainer why the UK or the US or Italy or Spain or Chile wouldn't do this as well. I'll leave it open for questions now.
I'm fascinated by the numbers which came out of Brazil, and you posted those, and I put them on my blog, and I'm really pleased that it's working there. Yeah. And I think for myself that it could work in the UK, because we've got a very large proportion of people who are entirely outside the pension system when it comes to private funding, self-employed, a large number of people who are sort of in employment but not in paid employment. Correct. And these are people who have capital and who have an income requirement more than they can get from the state. We've seen a lot of interest from people in buying extra state pension recently. So, I mean, on that side, I agree with you. But where I don't agree with you is that we actually have infrastructure in this country to do much more, to actually allow people to take risk. And I know you don't like the idea of people taking risk, but I do.
I never said that. No, Henry, let's be careful. I never said that. This is the safe asset, right? So in any good asset allocation product, you have to have a choice between a safe asset and a risky asset. So I advocate for having a lot of stocks depending on your risk tolerance, right? For somebody who, like me, has no interest in taking that risk, this would be, a large part of my portfolio. So let's be careful. This is the safe asset. It's not the only asset.
Okay, so you leave space. You're not saying that you don't want to have a riskier approach and for people to take risks for more reward.
Absolutely. In fact, I've written a paper in the Financial Analyst Journal with a colleague called Adam Kobor, where we show how a dynamic allocation between stocks and bonds gets you much closer to your target income than any other product out there in the market today, right? So we can show this. It's easy, right? Because without the safe asset, your current DC plan is incredibly risky, right? Everything that you hold today is risky relative to that income stream. So until I give you this risk-free asset, you're taking uncompensated risk, which, if you don't know how to manage it, typically ends up giving you a bad outcome, which means the government then bails you out. So I'm not advocating for no risk at all. I'm saying depending on everyone's risk preference, you can completely customize it. And that's what makes this very interesting.
So can I just ask about that a bit more, Aaron? So say you're a person where you're putting some money away, but you want to try to make your retirement savings go as far as possible in retirement. You're not wealthy. What kind of split would you hold between this low risk assets and stocks? Say if you're age 40, age 50, age 60, can you just give us more of a feel for that?
So it depends on, so in fact, what I'm hoping would happen is that the asset management industry, which is where, my day job is, would come up with a product that says, by the way, here's your target retirement income. This is how much you already have, and this is how much you're willing to contribute. And you can actually solve for that problem, right? So you can customize it to the nth degree. I also own a fintech firm. So I know that this is technology enabled as well, very easily, which you cannot do today in these classic CDC systems, because in a way, what SeLFIES are doing is it's creating what I would call an individual DB. Now, it sounds absurd to call it an individual DB, but by saving intelligently, you're locking up what guaranteed retirement income you're going to get when you get to retirement. So for a 40-year-old with medium risk tolerance, again, I've got it in the paper. I can pull it out because we did some simulations, but maybe the allocation is 40% to stocks and 60% to this, right? Now, in my advocacy for asset allocation, because that's what I advise my pension funds clients globally, is the one mistake we make is finance theory is completely wrong in how they tell us how to make decisions. We're told to put our trust in a stupid asset allocation optimizer, which Markowitz deserves a Nobel Prize for what he does. But everybody forgets that the first assumption he makes is that we know what the future looks like. And I made this mistake for a $12 billion pension fund in late 1998. We made forecasts of equity returns of being 9% annualized for the next 10 years. And every bank, every institution that you would know, Goldman, you name them, JP Morgan, Credit Suisse, all of them told me 9% is the annualized equity return. The realized return was negative. So we have no clue about the future. So investing in stocks is an incredible gamble. It's actually worse than going to the horse races. Right?
I'm going to have to pull you up.
This naive assumption that it's going to give you a positive return. And so you have to be careful when you think about what you want to do with your risk taking.
At the risk of you dominating the conversation to a point where nobody else gets a chance to say anything, Aaron, right? Stefan, you were trying to say something and you've got to shut this man up.
Yeah, well, I was thinking it's a good idea if your risk-free investment is an inflation-linked lifelong income. And for example, in the UK, you do have the state pension, which is triple locked and basically inflation-linked income. If you don't have enough money to kind of get a meaningful addition of inflation-linked income, you probably could be better off thinking about how I'm going to spend my pot over a limited period of times. And actually, since you already have all your assets, more or less, in the safe asset, which is the state pension, you might actually say, yes, this is a framework that is useful for people who have enough money to really want to go for a lifelong income and have it inflation linked. And then it's a good base. But as you said in your own papers, Arun, it's sort of, depending on what your goal is, that's going to determine how you're going to do the asset allocation.
Correct.
And what I see in the debate in the UK and other places is the goal is not the same for everyone. And therefore, it's really difficult to say this is a universally great solution. So that's kind of my reflection on your SeLFIES.
No, so what I'm saying is I would have an individually enabled app, right, for every individual. So what you want and what Simon wants can be completely optimized individually, but without SeLFIES, there's no way you can get an efficient solution. So you may have 60% in SeLFIES, Simon may have 100, Henry may have 0. But that's where technology allows you today to have an individual solution where you can mix and match as you please. In fact, like I said, the dumbest product in the market today are these life cycle funds, right? Because they're offered on average to people with a retirement, date of 2025, and they arbitrarily are changing between stocks and bonds because you got 1 year older. And if you work out the math,
but Arun, my point was the state pension is almost a SeLFIE in that sense. It delivers what you wanted, and you might already have more than you want in the safe assets. So
I don't have a problem with that, but how liquid is it? Can you go back and change your decision, right? Because guess what? Our life cycle is completely random. I don't know when I'm going to die. I don't know when my situation is going to change. I don't know if I'm going to have a medical emergency. The beauty with a SeLFIE, and this happened in Brazil, is within the first 5 months, people actually sold some of their SeLFIES back to the treasury. So what I'm asking for is a liquid version of that. Why have something that's illiquid and bureaucratically difficult and excludes the private sector from participating in that?
So, Aaron, are you saying have no state pensions? So instead people can kind of buy these. Okay.
You don't have to. It's not one or the other. It can be complementary. Right. If people are happy with the state pension and it's sponsored on a pay-as-you-go basis, and the state is able to sustain it, God bless them. This can be completely complementary. So in Brazil, actually, we started this as a pillar 3 solution with the idea that you would then move it into pillar 2 and make it institutional class as well, given the success they've had. In other countries, we've advocated for this to be the second pillar solution with the ability to also have the third pillar. This is not meant to replace the first pillar, right? So we're saying, listen, if you're happy with your first pillar, which let's be honest, there's no first pillar in any country that is demographically sustainable, right? They're all basically bankrupt because of the demographic pyramid being inverted. If countries want to continue that, which is just going to continue to raise your taxes, I have no problem with that. But for the funded component, without this instrument, you're running a massive risk, even in a CDC plan, because you cannot hedge small, younger cohorts for what they want as their target income.
I will come back to that at the end, I think, because I really want to pick up on what you were saying. And Stefan, I think, talked to us really about what you were saying about choice architecture in recent discussions we were having on the pension playpen.
Yeah, so when I look at the pension problem, I'm trying to say, what is a real problem to solve? What are the stuff we are trying to solve? And a lot of times, Einstein said something clever once. He said, if you have 1 hour to solve a problem, spend 55 minutes defining the problem and then 5 minutes to routinely solve it. My view is that in industry, we typically spend 5 minutes trying to define the problem, and then we have 55 minutes to sort of solve it. And the reason for that is mainly because in our organizations and in our society, you don't like people coming with problems. You want people to come with solutions. And that makes our very much solutions oriented, but then we have more solutions than people need, and there's a lot of solutions looking for a problem out there. So I was trying to say, what if you look at it from the other perspective? And then when you're thinking about what is the problem? Well, for auto-enrollment in the savings phase, the main problem was people wouldn't engage. People wouldn't start saving. And everybody knows that if you can get people to start saving, it will be a good thing. So that what we tried to solve there was inertia. How can we use inertia to actually get people into saving? For the spending phase, when you're about to transform your pension pot into something, you have a complete different problem. Because at that point, for most people, the advice you can give them is very different, because everybody end up in a different situation when you're close to retirement. So Henry and Arun and Simon, if we look back at our people we went to secondary school with, they ended up in very different places. Some did really well and some didn't do that well. But we more or less had the same starting point, because we come from the same village and had the same education early on. So when we were young, you can give everybody the same solution, save and contribute a lot and take investment risk and think will turn out fine. But when you're going to solve a problem of retirement, well, people also want the money, and all the situations are different. But you're then not faced with an inertia problem. You're faced actually with a very complex choice situation, which is so daunting that people actually turn off and don't want to make a choice. You get paralyzed in there. And the choice is not just the product, it's sort of the interaction between the tax code, your products, you have probably many of them, and also social security, because if you're losing your housing allowance because you took a certain payout structure, you might actually feel like you get an implicit margin tax. So when you're looking at that, I would say it's a very, very different problem. And what we need to solve is actually make this simple for people to make the choice. And I think government has an important role to play there in simplifying the tax code and take away a lot of these breaks so it becomes clearer. So my dream, sounds harsh now, but my dream would be you shouldn't need to have guidance or advice in order to make this decision, because it's not that complicated. It's just very complex because there's so many things interacting, and that scare people not to make choices. So when solving this, I'm thinking the choice architecture is a solution for it. And we should not have a default solution that some people may argue. So once you hit, your targeted retirement age, it automatically transfers into a payout solution, because no provider knows the overall situation of the member. And it's much better to sort of put someone in a holding pattern until they come and say, I want my money, and then have a guided choice architecture through which they can get a more informed decision. So I'm in that way trying to look at the problem and try to identify what the challenge is. And I think that's where I want to stop now and hear what your thoughts are on it.
Well, and Henry, if I can just jump in, because the last time you and Stefan had a conversation, the one comment that struck me and stuck with me from that one was Stefan kept talking about flexibility, right? In fact, I'm surprised you didn't use that in your discussion now, because to me, that was the critical point, which is, like you said, we have no clue where we're going to end up. So if I don't have flexibility in the choice architecture to adjust for changing life circumstances, it's going to be a disruptive system in a way, right? So, yeah.
I'm not sure we need flexibility. I think that most of us actually make life choices which are based around the same thing. We choose to go to work, and that work pays us an income. We choose to be part of the social security system. We don't opt out of it, and therefore we get a state pension. And most of us just choose to stay in what we think is a workplace pension system. But when we get to retirement, we find that instead of having made a choice about getting a pension, we made a choice to get a whole range of options, which in the UK we call pathways. And these pathways don't really make a lot of sense to us, because we don't really think about our pension as something which we want to leave to our kids. We don't really think about our pension as being a big cash sum which we can spend whenever we like, or even nowadays do we think about our pension being something we give to an we give our money to an insurance company and they pay us an income for life. What we actually want is something which is very much more like what our mums and dads had, which was a pension paid to us by a third party at a rate which we kind of understood. It was part of the deal. And we're just not getting that anymore. And we're kind of going, where did that go? And I think to come to your point about flexibility, I don't actually think I want flexibility. Terry Pullinger is a great guy who's the architect of much of what happened at the Royal Mail. said, I want the freedom not to have freedoms.
But that's a bit paternalistic, and that may work for him. It may not work for all his participants, right? Because if you're running a pension plan for 50,000 people, to not permit flexibility is actually a dreadful thing, because flexibility has value. If I have a medical emergency and I have to go and borrow it at 18%, I may much rather borrow it from myself at 9%. In fact, Professor Modigliani had this brilliant idea of allowing people to have credit cards against their 401k balances, and the credit card companies squashed it, right? Because otherwise you borrow from them at double the cost, which is idiotic again. It's amazing how things are messed up. But what SeLFIES does for you, and in fact in Brazil, the way they designed it is the monthly payment arrives on the same date on which your Social Security payment arrives. So what you get is a steady income stream showing up in your bank account on the same day that you're getting your Social Security. So we've designed it to replicate exactly your DB pension payout, with one difference. We don't give you the longevity piece, and we can talk about that separately. But we've given you the flexibility to either add to it or subtract to it or change the date on which it starts. Why wouldn't you want that? Supposing you decide you want to retire 5 years earlier or 5 years later because you haven't saved enough. What I was trying to do is prevent the problem that Stefan's idea, I think, brings about, was we have this accumulation phase and the decumulation phase, and then you have different parties, which raises your cost. I said, why don't you just slam it all into one, which an annuity typically would do if you can do a good annuity. But then you pay a massive cost, and it's inexpensive, it's complex, it's inflexible. So that's what SeLFIES are doing. SeLFIES are nothing more than an annuity and a bond. That's all it is, right? It's nothing more than that, a term annuity.
Simon, I'm looking for support here from you. I'm looking for you to come in on the back of my Terry Pullinger comments. And
well, I think I'm kind of between the two of you here, because I think you need some flexibility in terms of how much money to put away to save, when to retire. But a lot of people also want quite a lot of guidance. They get near retirement and think, well, I don't know what all these different options are. I need a bit of help. I know a bit about, I know I want to retire. I know a bit about my health. I'm pretty healthy. I might live a long time. I might not. I've got dependents. You want guidance to choose the option for you, and it will be different for different people. That's my take on it.
But surely what you've been working on with RM and others, as Royal Mail, it has been the exactly opposite of that. A non-guided type product which gives everyone an income in retirement, which is effectively a wage for life. I mean, that's
it is. Yeah. So my comments just now, it's about kind of the UK workers as a whole. They're different workforces with different needs. Royal Mail's union and the company wanted something where the pension is provided for the workforce. That it's a kind of population who don't want to have to make difficult decisions at the point of retirement. So that was one of the drivers for their design. But that design, I think, would work for some workforces, but I wouldn't say it's kind of the right thing for everybody. I wouldn't roll it out across the UK to all workforces, for example.
What do you think?
Can I jump in? Because you had a comment there. You want the same thing as your grandpa and grandma had, and everybody wants that. When pension was good old golden defined benefit, and a promise was a promise, and that kind of stuff. But that also means you should put down around 20 to 30% of your salary in order to buy that, because that's what it would cost if you would go and look at Arun's solution with SeLFIES. So the problem is, in the old days, you got a very good pension deal. And if you want to have the same pension deal with the same type of retirement date today, you're going to have paid so much you can't afford it. And I think that is the challenge. So when you took away and walked into DC, everybody decided, or the industry, the companies, the employer decided you can lower the contributions because you're going to earn more in expected return. And that, I think, was a big challenge in the UK around, the millennium, when most people closed their schemes. So I would say, yes, it's good to want the good old stuff. If you have enough savings, yes, sure, you can have it, but most people are not going to be there. And that's what I'm saying. And to Simon, I would agree with the sort of choice architecture, but just because it's very difficult to make choices another way is trying to make them more understandable and simpler, and simplify things so people actually can make choices. Today is you almost need to be, you need to have your best friend to be an actuary who has a hobby of learning all these kind of exemptions to the rules that change every year in order to get something good out of it. And we know all a colleague like that, and most people don't. So that's my point, is sort of, are we solving, yes, are we like generals trying to fight the last war, or shouldn't we kind of look ahead and try to say, given what people have saved today, some people are actually going to retire with a total pot of 150,000. You're not going to get a lot of income from that. So how do you get the most out of it? How do you distribute that over your retirement? So with Arun's approach, you could probably say, for the first 15 years, I want to have some stability, and then later on, I might want to have some variability, but I expect to live out of my state pension for that. So I think as an industry, I think we're looking to solve the old problem, and that's going to leave a lot of members in a bit of a tough position who doesn't have enough to actually get a good solution from the old model. So that was sort of the thoughts that's been in my mind.
I think we're now moving into my section, and I'm going to sort of come back quite hard on this, because I grew up with not just sort of gold-plated stuff, but I grew up with the idea of SeRPs. And that's the state earning related pension scheme, where I was going to get extra state pension depending on how much I earned, yeah, which is actually very close to what Arun has been putting forward. Yeah. And the reason we moved away from the state earning related pension scheme was that we felt we could do better on our own, which quite clearly most of us couldn't, because we've learned that actually we're now in a situation where getting that extra income from the state would be really useful. But behind that, there is something which is, I think, really important, which is that actually we do kind of believe that there is a better use of capital than to give it to the government to invest in infrastructure or whatever the government does with it. But we can actually go out and invest that money in the private sector to do really great things. Yeah. And therefore, yeah, there is a school of thought, and this is a school of thought which I subscribe to, because if we'd done it all over again back in 1978, when Barbara Castle was thinking these things with Keith Joseph, we'd have actually created something very similar to a funded CDC plan for everybody, yeah, where effectively we were giving the money that came out of the national insurance pool into some kind of sovereign wealth fund, which invested in GDP growth. Now, we can't get back to that. We can't recreate, if you like, the conditions of 1978. But what we can do is start getting more like the conditions which I know the Mansion House reforms are going to envisage, whereby a great deal of money, which would otherwise go to the state, Aaron, no disrespect, but the government don't actually want the money, goes instead into the kind of growth that we need to reinflate our economy and make the next generation a lot easier. So I'm sort of a pro investment guy, and I'm not a pro investing in government gilts guy. And therefore, and this is going to the consumer bit, what I'd really like to see is a product which basically takes all these decisions away from me, but does give me the promise that I'll be invested in the UK economy. And I think that the collective approach to DC works really well for that. Yeah, because, you know, I don't want to get involved in kind of making stock selection decisions. I don't want to get involved in having to manage my own drawdown so that I don't run out of money. I want this done for me, and I want to give the money to some clever chap like Simon Eagle and say, Simon, yeah, devise the investment strategy, devise the decumulation strategy, get on with it. If it goes wrong, I'm going to come and get you, yeah, but I trust you, so I'm sure it won't. And that's kind of like where I'm at. That's where my head's at. I just want something done for me. A phrase which Simon himself has used. I've stolen it. It's his phrase, actually. So that's my bit done. Yeah. What do you think, guys?
So if you don't mind, I'll jump in for a second.
You jump in.
One is, okay, my first ever book I read in economics was Free to Choose by Milton Friedman, right? So I've drunk the Kool-Aid as well. But you have to remember the experience over the last 20 years came from a massive inflation of central bank balance sheets. So what spectacular returns you saw in the stock market didn't come because of any other reason that the central banks made the borrowing cost for companies close to zero. At this stage today, when all these central banks are talking about withdrawing 13 trillion from markets, would you want to put your money in the stock market? That's not what I'm telling my clients. Okay. And knowing what I know of what these pension fund risks are, which are being completely unmanaged, I would say you're taking an incredibly risky bet. That's
Well, here I totally disagree with you. The answer is yes, I do want to be in the market. Yeah.
No, you want, okay, so you will pay a price for that, and that's okay. But to your comment, for the general population, if you don't have retirement income products, which the regulator then makes sure that the financial industry is only compensated if they deliver that retirement income, okay, that's the outcome you want. Today, in America and these life cycle funds, and even in the UK, your provider can generate a completely random outcome. They collect your fees, and you're left holding the bag. So one of the challenges I have, which I write about in my book, is that the risk taker, in this case, the Royal Mail Pension Fund, is de-linked from the risk bearer, which is the participants. So if Simon's system fails and they deliver terrible pensions to the individuals have no recourse. With my instrument, you now have a regulator who can say, if you don't deliver at least 70% of their average last 10 years of salary or whatever, you come up with whatever metric you want, but it's got to be a monitorable metric that says you're not delivering and therefore you don't get your fees or you need to repay your fees.
No recourse. Simon, surely, I mean, we don't have the PPF behind CDC, but there has to be something behind there. What kind of security are you giving the Royal Mail guys other than, yeah, we'll give you our best endeavours?
There isn't a guarantee in terms of level of pension. I guess the promise is, here's the deal: you pay in this certain amount of money. Here's how we'll invest it. Here's how we'll distribute it as pension income. The amount of pension will depend on how the assets have done and how long people are living, etc. But we can't promise any particular level, because if we were to make a promise, someone has to make that good, whether it's the company or an insurer or a state, and there isn't anybody who is available to make that guarantee.
Yep,
I want you to biff Aaron over the head and say to him, we should have more confidence in the markets. And he's getting, I mean,
it's time dependent. Henry, it's completely time dependent. That's what I make my day job out of, right? Is this idiotic idea that you should always hold 60% in stocks because it came out of a Markowitz optimizer is one of the most idiotic things pension funds do. And I did that too. Okay, so I'm telling you a story of a mistake I made, and I've realized finance theory is wrong. Markets go like this. Why is your asset allocation like this? Right? Markets could go like this. Japan, take Japan, right?
And how about if you hold it? I mean, I guess if you're a 20-year-old just starting to save, you're holding those assets for maybe 40, 50 years before you can retire. So you mentioned earlier that there was a period of 10 years where stocks were turned negative. But what about 20 years, 30 years, 40 years? I think if you look at any period in history, well, but that's if but here we're talking about global investment. So you're talking about what happened in Japan for the last 30 years, if that happened on a global basis, because it's hard to imagine how that could happen.
If you take 13 trillion out of the market, if you take 13 trillion out of the market like the central banks claim they would, yes, you would have a Japan-like situation globally. The whole market is being supported by central banks, okay? And this is what people fail to recognize. It's allowed the corporate side and the CEOs to make enormous salaries, right? The labor hasn't benefited at all. And basically, if you take 13 trillion out of the market, you don't have the kind of growth you had, right? So you have to be very conscious of where you are in the investment cycle. I'm not saying don't ever invest in equities. This is not the best time to do it, right? That's what wait for a crash and then buy. Wait for a crash and then buy. That would be my advice.
My comment is also, Arun, you said it early on, that with an aging population globally, that's also going to put a bit of a dent in prospective growth. Henry, I would like to, well, first, Simon, I want to comment on what you said, is that with CDC, you can make it more stable if you have a more defensive investment strategy. And the more aggressive you invest, the more volatile it will be. So I think there is important for the one who designed it to come up with a, how do you say, Goldilocks solution, which is not too strong or not too aggressive and not too defensive, right? So I think that's an important part to figure it out. And to Henry, what you said about the mansion house, and this I want to be clear is my personal view on this one because it's quite sensitive in the UK. But if you're going to take a lot of money, invest in the UK, and you also have your contributions coming out of the UK, you actually have quite a lot of country-specific risk if the government can't get it together. Yes. And also, if you look at my biggest fear would be if in 78 they would have been able to create this sovereign wealth fund, which most surely going to say is pension money, and the money going to be used to do regional development, which not necessarily might be the best return for the people who put the money in. So I'm always very cautious when the government wants you to do something with the money, unless, because it's a bit like, yes, everybody likes the story that we could invest in our own country, we could generate growth, etc., etc. But are you then expecting the trustees to be able to then find the right projects, have a view on, due to the energy transition, where you're going to have the most return, what the next technology going to be? That makes, Arun's talk about timing the markets or going with the cycles look simple, right? So okay. I'm a bit worried here that the government wants something, but do we have the organizational structure to be able to deliver it? And should you do it? Because maybe you should invest in countries which have a different demographics, where you might actually get a return that might counteract what you see in the UK.
No, I mean, I live in a country. You live in either Sweden or Holland or wherever it is you are today. I don't know where you are today, but where are you? Are you in the UK?
Holland today.
You're in Holland, right? Okay. I mean, I live in the UK, right? And we have classrooms which are falling to pieces because they're made of the wrong kind of concrete. Yeah. Now, I want to live in a country where that doesn't happen. I want to have money invested in our schools so that we don't have kids being sent home from school because they haven't got a classroom to go to. And I don't see how we're going to get to that situation unless we have private investment in our infrastructure, which does things better than government, because I have no confidence, absolutely no confidence, that we can actually run this country, with just from the state. We need that private state cooperation. Yeah,
Henry, there's no doubt that if it's a choice between the government or the private sector doing something, the private sector is always going to be more efficient, right? Unless there's let's take away, social goods and the like. But if it's a private enterprise like running a school, there's no doubt in my mind. But there is a role for a government to play in building infrastructure. And so if you consider education to be infrastructure, in fact, Brazil has issued an education bond that I advocated for much the same reason, right? They said we need funds to be able to improve our educational system because we've got a young population, to Stefan's point, and we've got to break the cycle of poverty. And the way we do that is through education. So they're taking a really long-term perspective, and they've issued an education bond, which uses the same technology that we use for the retirement bond. So you can do all sorts of creative things. But to go back to one very
where's the private sector bit in that? All you're saying is, give more money to government, give more money to government. I want to see the private sector lifting up the UK economy through the investment in the kind of UK growth stuff, which Mansion House.
But Henry, you have examples where this has gone so bad. In Sweden, they did public-private partnership to build a hospital, and it ended up being a total economically disaster for the taxpayers. We just wanted to cry. And I heard there's sort of similar things happening in the UK and the US as well. So I think when it comes to school and buildings, well, you need a norm for how you're going to build, so you cannot cheat. And secondly, in Sweden and Netherlands, the government play actually quite a bigger role than in the Anglo-Saxon world, and it seems to work. And I think sometimes some stuff, when you're trying to hand it over to the private sector, it won't really work. For example, infrastructure like train lines and roads, it's probably good to have it centrally planned, and maybe you go and get a contractor to bid on it and build it, but you don't kind of separate it directly from the government. So I think what I see from this is if you have a weak government and a strong private sector, you're going to have a mess. You need a strong government and a strong private sector, so you have countervailing partners who can sort of have equal strength. Then you can get good things. So the challenge you have, Henry, with your problems, I think your government is a bit weaker than it could or should be.
So here's the danger, right? Henry, to go back to your point, we have to be very careful in the design of the pension system that we don't add elements of it which have, benefit to, individual institutions, right? So the 5 stakeholders that I see in the design of any pension system is the government, the employers, the employees, the regulator, and then the financial services industry. And everybody wants their certain part of it. And I think in my book, which Simon has had a chance to read, I came up with an acronym called super accessible, right? And each of these stands for something. What is S? It stands for sustainable. U is universal, right? P is portable. You can go through it. And that's basically where I said in talking to these various groups, how can we have the objectives? To Stefan's first point, let's first start with what's the objective that we want out of the pension system. Then let's design it. And what happened in this country is people first designed all these other systems, and then they tried to fit it to please, your desire to have better UK growth.
Okay, I'm gonna call in Simon, because otherwise he won't get a chance to talk.
Sorry, Simon.
He's got our solution, or the alternative to the state solution, in his head, and he's doing it. Yeah. So over to you, Simon. Right. And
Yeah, sure. And I'll frame it in terms of objectives. So when we survey individuals in the UK about what they want from their pension, most say they want an income for life in retirement. Most don't want to manage it themselves, but very few are buying annuities. Very few DC savers are buying annuities at the point of retirement. They're perceived as expensive. So what is it that people want? Well, it's an income for life that aims to outperform an annuity. And that's what CDC in decumulation tries to do. So it builds off having individual DC in accumulation, which I see as a good vehicle for accumulation. It then gives a new option at retirement. It doesn't need to be people's whole pots. They can keep some money for DC drawdown for flexibility if they want. They can hold some money back as a bequest if they want. But they can spend some on an income for life to top up their state pension. The money's then invested largely in growth assets while they're a young pensioner, then in lower risk assets while they're an older pensioner, to try to achieve that balance that Stefan talked about trying to achieve a fair level of returns, but not taking excessive risk, especially for a scheme that's, maybe if the scheme's matured, it's got mainly older pensioners. If you had mainly growth assets, then the pension levels could be too variable. So it's trying to achieve that balance. Doing that, it pulls just one.
Choices by cohort. I'm sorry. Are the choices, are people sort of segmented into cohorts, and how do you define the cohort? Is it strictly age based, or is it wealth or risk aversion based?
So under the design I'm looking at, people aren't in cohorts. So it only holds one generation of pensioners at a time. It's only people who've bought into it with some of their savings at retirement, but it pulls all of those pensioners together at one point in time.
And so this is the challenge you have, Henry, when you do a collective arrangement. And this is what I recommended to the Dutch pension that I'm an advisor to, is the Netherlands is going towards CDC, or their version of CDC, where they want some guarantee. And I said, if you're doing CDC, why not just have a clean DB slug, which is where you can issue your guarantee, and somebody has to be the residual claimant. Otherwise, you cannot have a guarantee, to Simon's point. And then have the second component, which is the DC. And you can have the best of both worlds, and it's clean. The problem with CDC is it's the worst of both outcomes, because you're forcing people to be in the system. You probably have to mandate participation to some degree, right, Simon? So people can opt out.
Why would you mandate it? I mean, you'd explain it as an option at retirement.
Can people opt out?
Yeah, they, at the point of retirement, they can decide what to do with their savings.
But not before.
Arun, can I stop you? Because the Dutch model is basically, once you work in a certain sector or industry, you are forced to be in a pension scheme, and then you end up in a solution that is for life, whether you like it or not.
Correct.
What Simon is talking about, this comes as an alternative. You're in your DC scheme, you're about to retire. What are the options? Well, I want to do a drawdown, or I want to have a CDC a la Simon's. So it's a complete different kind of choice situation.
But the interesting thing, but sorry, go ahead, Simon.
Well, I think the other point you're making earlier, Aaron, was so once you're in it, you're in it. So it's a bit like if you're in a DB scheme and you've retired, that provides your pension for the rest of your life. If you buy an insured annuity, that provides that income for your life. You could design something where you can get out of it again, but I see that as very complicated to do. It'd be you'd have to assess health at the point of transferring out. That would come with costs. I would just keep this as simple as possible, so people are buying an income for life.
So Simon,
I'll make a point here. I'll make a point here, which is really important and totally overlooked. When you are saving, you have a payroll which does a saving for you, and you can opt out of doing that because the payroll will do it as a default. When you are spending your money, e.g., you're getting an income, then you need to give somebody else your bank details, and you have to take an affirmative action to make that happen. So there is nobody who can be opted out of a CDC pension on the of a type that Simon's talking about, because they will have to opt in. They'll have to give their bank details and say, yes, I want that. So it has to be affirmative. Am I right, Simon?
Yeah. Oh yeah, it's an option. It's an option. It's not mandatory. Yeah.
I would be arguing that Simon should be begging UK Treasury to issue SeLFIES. He should be begging them, because
I thought you might, but
is CDC way more efficient. There's no way your system is currently efficient without this instrument. I can guarantee, I can show this
from the
any number of ways, right?
You would like to make a lifelong income solution based on SeLFIES. You need to pool longevity, and then all of a sudden you become a Hotel California anyway. So when you want to pool longevity, you become a Hotel California, because once you check in, you cannot leave. And I think that's a consequence of longevity pooling rather than anything else.
But that's the beauty of SeLFIES, is if you have people along the whole life cycle, in a bizarre way, you're going to get the average experience. So you can, at retirement, ask people, do you want to turn in your SeLFIE for a longevity indexed annuity? And if you have the average, because your Royal Mail has 46,000 participants, you should be able to get the average of the country. We've shown this. You can solve this problem very easily. If that doesn't work, I've got another bond called the Live Bond, which is the longevity indexed variable expiration bond, which again, the UK should issue, because in CDC, there's no way Simon can guarantee income, because he's now transferring the risk to the risk bearer, which are the participants. Because actual experience is wrong from your average expectation. Somebody is bearing that risk.
It's for people who are aiming for higher income than from an insured annuity. You on average you'll get it, but different eventualities will turn out in different ways. You might not get higher income, but in most scenarios you will.
Yeah, so that's the challenge you have. So Simon should be begging for liquid instruments that allow him to hedge the risk he's taking on behalf of the participants, which they are bearing for no decisions that they make, which is the risk bearer is separated from the risk taker, which is the board or the group of people who are making the investment decision. The moment you have that, this is a classical principal agent problem, which is what I do. And I see this in my pension world all the time. The decisions made by CIOs is not always in the best interest of their participants, because they've got a 5-year life cycle over which they want to either get another job or retire. Right?
Haven't we got those instruments in
2 years later?
Haven't we got those instruments for retirement already, Aaron? We've got gilts, we've got longevity swaps.
You cannot hedge gilts for a 25-year-old. I know that, right? That's how
No, I'm talking about in retirement. Retirement.
Even with gilts, it's such a complicated instrument, because the cash flows from gilts don't match your retirement cash flows. That's why we designed this as an intelligent gilt, right? It's a gilt indexed to inflation based on every coupon structure. So Simon, I did this for a living. I issued these crazy bonds for the World Bank. Bullet instruments are a terrible instrument to hedge the kind of risk you're taking. So you can get a way better instrument by telling UK Treasury, give me the instrument I want, not the one you want to issue. That would be your outcome.
I agree. It'd be a good extra option for investments. I mean, I wouldn't. It would be. I can imagine a CDC and accumulation scheme purchasing some of them, but alongside a lot of other investments too.
Absolutely, I don't have a problem with that. I'm just saying, as your base instrument, this has to be part of the solution. You cannot have an efficient CDC otherwise.
Arun, assuming someone has a reasonably sized pot, say £350,000 or something, if you would price what your state pension is worth, it's probably in the same neighborhood.
Yeah.
So even if Simon takes quite aggressive amount of risk in the CDC solution and it doesn't work out, still 50% of your sort of income will still be guaranteed and stable. So even if you lose, say, 50%, you're going to lose 25% of your income, right? So it is, to some extent, you need to look at the combination of them.
Absolutely. I'm not saying no. And in fact, the Netherlands, you have a brilliant system where you can log in and see how much you get from the state and how much you get from each of the companies you work for. No other country has that brilliant solution. I'm totally game for that.
Well, Sweden, Denmark, and...
But yeah, I'm just saying, it's not in the Anglo-Saxon world, which is terrible. But what I'm saying is somebody is taking that risk on behalf of the individual and saying, oops, sorry, go to your state pension because I screwed up. And that's not how you design an efficient system. People should be able to say along their life cycle, my goodness, I could lock in 75% today. Why is Simon taking this risk for me, right? They should have that ability to lock in and say, I'm done. I've got 90% of my desired target income. I'm happy. Or I've got 170% because the markets have rallied like a maniac. By not giving them that option and continuing to take risk on their behalf, you're doing them a disservice.
So
right?
they would have that.
I'm a free market guy, Henry. I want that.
So people would have that option at retirement. They could decide.
It should be at 45. Why should it be only at retirement? With SeLFIES, you can lock them up at 45.
Okay. Let Simon have his word.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, yeah, I kind of. I mean, for me, for someone aged 45, they're still way off retirement. They don't know when they want to retire. They don't know how much income they want. I would say flexibility is still good at age 45. A lot of people will have at least 20 years to go until retirement. So I mean, I'm close to age 45. Nearly all of my retirement savings are in growth assets because I'm thinking about the long term.
So here's the beauty of it. Can I show one slide from what the Brazilian app does for you? This is literally all you have to answer when you go to Brazil.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, so give me 1 second, okay? Because if you see how brilliant and simple that is, this could be offered to every one of your Royal Mail in participants, right? Tell me when you can see it. Are you able to see my screen now?
We're about to.
Yeah.
Okay. So literally, this is what you have to go and enter on the app, right? I am currently so many years old. That's the first sentence. Sorry, Google Translate doesn't do it in the best of English. I want to retire at such and such age, right? The extra income I want, so this is to Stefan's point, right? I'm getting my state pension and the extra income I would like to be guaranteed is X per month. And I have X number of real to invest now, okay? If they answer that and they press this little button, it actually comes back and says, okay, if that's what you want, then here's the instrument you buy. And it tells you a little bit more of what you need to buy if you want to do that. Why can't we design something that simple, which every individual can answer?
Brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. Yeah. So long as what you want to do is that. Yeah.
And if they don't want to, they don't have to come to this website.
No.
Go to another website.
Absolutely. This is what we're talking about as options. Yeah. So we have that as an option. Anyone can buy an annuity in this country, and anyone should be able to get into something as good as what you're doing. We would love to see this as an extra option. I think for where I'm going to have to start wrapping things up fairly soon, is what can we do for the generality of people? Is this the general solution, or is this an option which is apart from the general solution? To use Stefan's great phrase, when we're in the holding pattern, we're going round and round and round and round, yeah? Where is the airport? What's the landing strip we're actually going to hit, yeah? And I think that most people will want to hit the same landing strip. My personal view is that I want to be taking lots of risk throughout my life because I want lots of reward. I'm a risk taker. And I think most people will take a certain amount more risk than the zero risk that you're talking about. So that's my view. Yeah, I may be wrong. Simon is offering a product with some risk built into it. Yeah.
Except that they can only make the decision at retirement, which is a completely unnecessary requirement, is what I'm saying. If you have a market solution, Simon can let everybody track their flight path at any time they want. And they can say, I'm ready to land right now. And Simon shouldn't have to force them to say, oops, you need to wait to 65. if I want to retire at 50 and I've accumulated enough wealth, and the central banks have, flooded the market with money and given me a huge boon for no reason to have been compensated as such, if I want to lock it in, why can't I do that? And that's my only comment is I'm actually more free market than you are, Henry. That's what's
I think you're actually doing this CDC a disservice. It has got that flexibility, hasn't it? Simon,
no, it doesn't. Simon said only at retirement.
It's an option at retirement, but of course you can plan ahead. So age 45, you might be told there's going to be this option at retirement. Here are some projections based on these assumptions. If you put this much money away now, here's what we project you'll get from retirement. So of course it needs to start before the communications need to start before retirement, but the point at which you buy into the longevity pool would be from retirement.
And you don't need to do that, is my comment. Is that there's a market condition. You can do it at any time.
Let's just sum up. That's because we got to the end of our recording now. But Stefan, do you want to have a sort of final say on something? Your thoughts?
Well, do you want me to summarize it, or?
Yeah, summarize. You start.
That was a difficult one. I would say that there are many different solutions, and it's really important, as we said, when you're in the holding pattern, you need to figure out where you want to land, and not all solutions will work for everyone. And here's when the analogy breaks down. You probably want a combination of solution as well. So you want to land at 2 airports. You want to do a step over. But I think we're also in a place, depending on where we come from, right? So we have a situation in the UK, which is what it is. And we need to find a solution that works in that framework. And I would say there are many ways of building it. So when I look at things and trying to classify stuff in my own head, it's like, what kind of cash flow profile do I want? Do I want more earlier and less later? That's kind of a choice. And then comes to what Simon talked about. What's my trade-off between affordability and stability, right? So, and Arun has the same with the SeLFIES. You buy stability, and if you want to take risk, well, you're going to get affordability later on, but that's a choice you have to make. And finally, what I think is often missed is the sort of the annuity pooling. So, for example, with the CDC that Simon talks about, actually, one of the big things there is that you pool your individual longevity and therefore can get a lifelong income. And you could do that as well in Arun's solution. But then once you sort of do that, you cannot step out, you cannot change anymore. So when I start looking at that, it's very easy. We sort of have a preference in that tree, so to say. And we say, I don't like the solution because it pools longevity. But that's wrong, because if you want to do that, you need to find a good solution that do it cost efficiently. And I think one good thing that Arun pointed out is that, well, some of these products are more or less efficiently implemented in the market. And I think there's nothing wrong with annuities from insurance companies. They're probably very well priced in the context of what they have to do with regulatory capital, etc. And therefore, if you can find a way, we can offer this longevity pooling at a much, much lower cost, because you don't need all this risk capital put aside. Of course, that's a good way forward. And I think CDC is one way of achieving this. You can do it in other ways. You've seen, for example, the solution in Australia with Q Super. They developed something looking like CDC. You have it in Sweden as well. It's called traditional life insurance. And I think the Dutch, they also have a CDC solution where the risk is passed on. So it's just different flavors of it. But the common of that is you pool your individual longevity. And so that was sort of the product part of the summary. From the user experience part and the member perspective, I think it's really important to look at it from the shoes of very different members. And I think, Henry, you have the view of what you would like to have, and people from your age cohort who do have a decent amount of savings put aside. And then you have to think about what's going to happen to other generation, other cohorts. And that's why I think you need many landing strips, depending on who the people are. And I think overarching is, this is a very complicated matter. We make it more complicated than that used to be. Regulation make it more complicated. The tax system makes it more complicated. So anything we can do to make it more understandable and easy to understand these solutions, I would welcome. And I think the more the government trying to protect people, all good intentions, you also add complexity to the system, which make it much more difficult for people to choose. So I would say from that, I think there's no clear, this is the way forward, but I think we do have a good starting point in the UK, and there's a lot of solutions around. And I think people just need to be able to get to the solution that works for them, and without having to consult, take advice. And the only way you can do that is to simplify the system. So I think that would be my sort of summary. Henry, do you want to add something? Or
no, I don't, because we're way past time, but also because it was a bloody good summary. So thank you very much indeed for both kicking off and ending this. Arun, thank you for brilliantly expanding on the selfie concept. And Simon, thank you for explaining in such simple terms what a CDC is about, because me, as the humble amateur, the purchaser of this stuff, I've got a lot out of this. Thank you very much indeed.